All right, for those watching from home, we are here in the Batavia Public Library in Clermont County, east of Cincinnati, roughly 10 miles from the earthwork we are here to discuss. The takeaway from my talk today is that Israelites did it. The question in my wordplay is, what exactly did they do? All right. My name is Geoffrey Sea. I've been researching the ancient earthworks of southern Ohio for most of my adult life. And I administer the Adena Core group on Facebook, which I invite you all to join if you're not already a member. My academic training is as a historian. I studied history as an undergraduate at Harvard, which I mention only because that's what actually brought me to Ohio, because as some of you may not know, Harvard actually sponsored a lot of the original archaeological excavations in Ohio and has literally, well, I was going to say millions, I think it's close to that, of artifacts from Ohio still in the Harvard archives. And it was back when, now it's all sensitive, back when it was less sensitive, Harvard was very open about displaying these Ohio artifacts, and it was seeing those artifacts in the anthropology building at Harvard, which was my favorite place to study as an undergraduate. That's what got me involved in this whole business. And it was Frederick Ward Putnam, who was the first real professional archaeologist on the Harvard faculty, who led most of the excavations in Ohio. I also was a graduate student at MIT and Columbia. I pride myself in finding the answers to problems in archaeology by studying the history, as opposed to what archaeologists do, including the history of the archaeologists and others who claim to interpret the mounds. For example, we can only understand Serpent Mound in Adams County by studying the biography of Frederick Ward Putnam, because he was the man who reconstructed Serpent Mound. I should say next.
Oh, okay. Let me pull that
All right. So to many, many observers, and I should say careless observers, they look at this drawing, which I will refer to as the Roberdeau drawing. He was the man who literally drew this. This appeared to be a Hanukkiah, which is a name for a Hanukkah menorah, an 8 or 9 branch menorah, as opposed to a usual 7 branch menorah, and an oil lamp, right? So many, many people have seen that and have drawn all sorts of conclusions from that, unwarranted conclusions. And what I'm mainly doing here today is giving you the real story behind this. So next. Okay, so this is Serpent Mound. And so it was Frederick Ward Putnam of Harvard who reconstructed Serpent Mound in the 1880s and who massively changed it, and which few people realize. So lots of people think that there's an egg at the front. And in fact, the artist who did this made this even look more like an egg than what looks there today. Well, there never was an egg. The Adena who built Serpent Mound never intended there to be an egg there. But Frederick Ward Putnam wanted there to be an egg. And so when he reconstructed the earthwork, he made it into an egg. And ever since then, everyone has thought there was an egg there, and everyone has engaged in all of this useless drivel, really, about what the egg symbolized. Well, it only symbolized something to Frederick Ward Putnam. There was no egg for the Indians who made Serpent Mound. So I introduced that as that's sort of my specialty is, looking at what the archaeologists and the artists did as how that has affected our interpretations. So an even clearer case of biography elucidating the archaeology is the one before us, the case of so-called Hanukkiah Mound near the East Fork of the Little Miami River. Next. This is a map, and this shows, and I'm going to suggest in my talk that we rename this mound because it shouldn't be called Hanukkiah Mound anymore. I'll get to that later. But this is a map. This is approximately where it is. We're now in Batavia here. Notice, one thing to notice about this map is that I've marked the 39th parallel on here because the earthwork, which thanks to Sean and Cindy, and we all, the three of us, went and explored this site about 2 or 3 years ago. And we're, at least I'm confident, I won't speak for them, I'm confident that this is the actual site of where the earthwork was. And that site happens to sit on, almost directly on, the 39th parallel. And that becomes very important to this story. And we will see later why that's important to the story. Next. Okay. Can we go back? Yes. Okay. So you all know who this is. This is when we visited the site. This is on the site. And yeah, I love this photo. This is to give an idea now, first, that the site is very elevated over the level of, this is the East Fork of the Little Miami River. So you can see that we're quite a bit above the river, and that's important for interpreting all the drawings because, you have this thing that resembles a menorah surrounded by an earthen wall on all sides that's roughly square. And what's important to understand is that wall is not a kind of freestanding structure on a level plane. That wall marks the edge of the boundary of the terrace that's above the river. And so we're now right at the edge where that wall probably was right underneath where these logs are. So we're at the edge of that terrace that overlooks the river. And that's really important for understanding the site. Next. And here, this is again is the edge of the terrace where the wall was. And I think it's very hard to capture this in photos because it's so eroded, it's so highly eroded, so not much is left there of what used to be there. But in this photo, I think you can see that this is the remnants of the wall, of the actual earthen wall that was on the edge of the terrace. Next. And I took this, even though my eyes are closed, or I had Cindy.
I took that.
Cindy took this
I
picture.
waited for you to close your eyes.
But I included this anyway because I wanted to show I'm now off the western edge of the terrace, and I wanted to show how steep it was. That it's really a very steep drop off on all sides. And I'm sort of climbing back up onto the terrace of the earthwork. Next. And this is, now, you may remember, I don't want to bring it up again, but the picture of the earthwork. But you remember that may remember that there are two big notches in the northern wall that, they're almost like indents. And it's one of those indents that forms the oil lamp image, right? And I wanted to show that those notches are not something that was put in to create an image of something. That's where the terrace is broken by some creeks, some spring-fed creeks that form these ravines that interrupt the shape of the overall terrace. And this is one of those notches to show, and these are pretty deep ravines that go down to a little creek that's at the bottom there. Next. And this this was an area, we were really reliant on Sean's reconstruction of this site. And Sean tried to identify where he thought some of the earthwork features were. So this is one area where Sean thought some of these features might be, but I took this to give you an idea of how difficult it was to tell if we are looking at some natural, change of the landscape, or are we looking at some remnant of an old earthwork. It's really, really hard. So our identification of the site is based on the overall shape and also of descriptions where it should be. And Sean followed a particular description that said it should be 20 miles upstream from Milford, from the Milford Works. And so he looked 20 miles upstream from the Milford Works and found this site. And he deserves a lot of credit because we think that he's the first person. Lots of other people have claimed to find the site of this earthwork. It looks like they're all wrong, but Sean, I believe, is correct. But even though we can come to that conclusion from looking at the overall shape and the location, it's really hard on the ground to look at individual features. Now, in the future, if this is investigated by archaeologists, they may be able to dig in this soil and tell that, it's been disturbed, it's been part of an earthwork, but, none of us are archaeologists. So, next. Now, this is the earliest drawing of the earthwork, and here you can see these two notches that I was talking about. So these two things are ravines. This was made by a man named William Lytle II, who was famously the wealthiest man in Southwest Ohio in the post-revolution days. He was a surveyor, and he purchased huge tracts of property from the Revolutionary War veterans that hired him to survey their land. Sean is a distant relative of Lytle. through marriage, unfortunately did not inherit any of his money, but has some connection to him historically. Lytle was also an important Freemason, as will become prominent in this story, involved in founding the Masonic Lodge of Cincinnati. And he surveyed the site and made a precursor to this drawing in 1803. We actually do not have any copies of his original drawing. They've all been lost. But this was a version of his map that was published in 1811 in another book. And so we believe that this is close to Lytle's original. And the important thing to realize here, and this is kind of a major theme of my talk, is that if you look at this drawing, there's no oil lamp, right? And this is much less like a menorah than the other drawing. Still could resemble that. But no one who looked at this version immediately said, aha, that's a Hanukkiah. It was only the Roberdeau version that gave people that idea, and it's because, we're all open to suggestion. And it was the shape of an oil lamp making this top part look like an oil lamp, which this really does not, right? On this drawing, that's very circular, which is how the landform, the shape of the landform. So this was not made to look like anything. This was just following the shape of the edge of the terrace, okay? And it was Roberdeau who later altered the image, and that's what we'll get to. Now, there's a question that pops into everyone's mind, of course, is if this is not a Hanukkiah, then what is it? What was it intended to be? Because we do think that this is fairly accurate. And here, this is another exercise in combating our prejudices or our jumps to conclusion. So you have to be very open-minded and question what assumptions did you make if you thought that this was a menorah. And one of the assumptions that we make in order to come to that interpretation is we assume that up means north, right? That this was pictured in the traditional Anglo-American way of putting north at the top of every map, right? If this was in Australia, they would flip it, right? They put their maps with south at the top. There's no necessary convention that north should be at the top. So, right? So what happens if we flip this? And Algonquians, if we look at Algonquian cartography, which is prodigious, Algonquians made huge numbers of maps. So if we look at Algonquian maps, they almost never did put north at the top. They usually put east at the top, but not always. Sometimes they put south at the top of their maps. All right? Okay, so this is another ancient Adena work in Knockemstiff, Ohio, in southern Ross County. This is gone now because pioneers ransacked it and stole all the stones to use for their housing foundations in Chillicothe and elsewhere. But it used to be there, and this points due north. Now, that makes sense because what's in the north? Two Algonquians is the Great Bear. The Great Bear, just like the Greeks, there was some diffusion of this idea that the Big Dipper represents a bear, and so this points north to the Great Bear. That makes sense. And you'll also notice that the fingers of the bear claw are very similar to the sticks, the candlesticks, you could say, right, of the earthwork here in Clermont. Except they seem to, and they also point north, but they seem to be, the effigy that it's part of seems to be headed south. Next. Okay, next. So if we flip it, we get this. Okay. Now you can see what it is. It is a thunderbird. And probably there was a head here that eroded away, or Lytle just didn't understand that, what that was, and so he didn't include it. But this is very, very much, you can tell from the forked tail and the wingtips, that this is a bird. And it's an Algonquian thunderbird because it fits the exact style of Algonquian thunderbirds. Next. This is one. This may be a turkey. It may not be a thunderbird. But this is a very old petroglyph in Illinois. And it's actually incised into the rock. So the part where it's incised was filled with snow. But you can see the Algonquian style of making wings is always with these vertical lines. And we think, specialists in Native American art, think that represents rain, right? They're called thunderbirds because they bring rain. So these vertical lines from the wings represent the rain coming down. Next. This is actually in Saskatchewan, also made by ancestors of the Cree, who are Algonquians. And again, you can see this is probably a thunderbird effigy. You can see the vertical lines that represent the raindrops coming down from the wings. Next. This and the next slide are paintings by a very famous Anishinaabe artist named Norval Morrisseau, very, very famous painter. This is one of his, and he painted numerous thunderbirds, always with the vertical lines coming from the wings. Next. This is another one of his that looks even more like the earthwork effigy here.
Really gorgeous.
Next. This is actually an Anishinaabe constellation, which we see as Cygnus the Swan, headed in the other direction. So our swan's head is headed this way, but they see it as a thunderbird headed in the opposite direction. And again, this was made by a modern artist, but again, you can see the convention among Algonquian people is to always represent those.
They incorporate that harp in the right-hand corner?
Well, what's in the background are the Greek constellations. So they showed on this chart, this is a chart of the whole sky, and you can see Cygnus the Swan in yellowish, around the edges. So they made multicolor the Anishinaabe constellations and on top of the Greek constellations. Next. So what is the Algonquian and specifically Shawnee word for a thunderer. It's Nenemhki. It's a general Algonquian term, but it's very strong in Shawnee language. The Shawnee are definitely direct descendants of the Adena. It's a similar word the word in Miamia language. Miamia is actually the tribe that the Little Miami is named after. So in their language, Nenemhki means hummingbird, not thunderer. But that's different than most Algonquian languages. So Nenemhki is probably the appropriate word to use, and we need to start using indigenous language for naming these earthworks. We have to get away from naming these earthworks after wealthy white property owners, right, who looted the mounds. So this is my suggestion for what we ought to be calling this earthwork. Next. This is William Lytle, picture of him. Next. All right, so now I'm going to move away from what was the earthwork really to its builders, and now talk about how it's been interpreted or misinterpreted. So the modern chronology starts with 1803. The earthwork is surveyed and mapped by William Lytle, who had been an Indian fighter present at the murder of the Shawnee chief Malumtha, by the way, an important sort of historical note. And he was the first landed millionaire of the West. Also in that same year, 1803, Ohio is admitted to the Union, and President Jefferson, who had excavated a mound in Virginia, takes a special interest in the Lytle drawings. In 1811, the Lytle map is redrawn in observations on the climate in different parts of America by Hugh Williamson. And this is the drawing that we know of as the early drawing. It's actually helpful that Williamson didn't credit Lytle for the drawing and has been generally accused of plagiarism, that he stole the drawings from Lytle. That's helpful to all our purposes because it probably suggests that the drawing is more genuine.
Where is that map now?
Well, the original Lytle.
Not the original, but the one that you said that meant.
Oh.
You said the other ones weren't there, but I thought Jeff Wilson had said something about one being in France.
I don't know. I don't know the location of that. In 1815, Daniel Drake, who wrote this short publication, relates Lytle's description of the earthwork here in Clermont County in this book. And next. And here's what he wrote, word for word. On the headwaters of the East Fork, other remains have been discovered, of which the principal bears a striking resemblance in its exterior to the first of those just described, meaning in Milford, i.e. a square fort, but within it differs from any which have yet been examined in this quarter in having 9 parallel banks or long parapets united at one end, exhibiting very exactly the figure of a gridiron. In this fort, most of the gateways are guarded by straight or crescent-formed batteries. I am told by General Lytle that none of these remains are more than 3 feet high. That's in 1811, so that gives you an idea of why they're even much more reduced now. They are all composed of earth and do not in general exhibit any appearance of a ditch. Now, the important thing here is, to me, as a historical interpreter, is that there's no mention of Israelites, Hanukkiah, oil lamps. None of that is here, right? To him and to Lytle, it looked like a gridiron. Now, what's a gridiron? A lot of us forget what a classic old gridiron was. This is a classic old gridiron, right? For grilling food by placing it over a fire, either a campfire or a fireplace. So to them, the earthwork looked like a gridiron and didn't have all those other associations, which tells us that those associations come later, right? Come from the later drawing, not from the early drawings. Next. So the chronology now continues. So in 1823, a new map is created by Isaac Roberdeau of the U.S. Bureau of Topographical Engineers in D.C. This becomes the Army Corps of Engineers, okay? So he's the head of the bureau in Washington that becomes the Army Corps of Engineers, and he makes the new drawing. In 1825, and immediately after that, we start getting this rush of interpretations about the Indians being Israelites. In 1825, just 2 years later, we have a book published called View of the Hebrews, or The Lost Tribes of Israel in America, by Ethan Smith, published in New England, referencing the archaeological finds in Ohio. And in 1830, the other Smith, no relation, Joseph Smith, publishes his Book of Mormon, saying that Ohio Valley Indians descend from the Israelites, also referencing the archaeological finds in Ohio, though not specific to this earthwork, but in general, as the evidence for his revelation, which he claims comes from directly from God, right? Next. This is the cover page of Ethan Smith's book. Next. Okay, so I just wanted to put these side by side so you can see even more clearly that what Roberdeau has done, right? He wants to make this into an oil lamp, right? So he takes this geometric shape, which is nothing more than a geometric shape, and he turns it into the handle of an oil lamp. And this straight wall here, he makes curved to make it look like it's the other side of the oil lamp. And he eliminates or greatly reduces what was the head of the Thunderbird. So it's really gone now. So now it just looks like 9 candlesticks. And you are less inclined to realize that it's really a bird flipped around. Next. Okay, so what are the implications of this? The implications are kind of immediate apparent. In 1834, the Roberdeau map is published in France by geographer David, I don't know how to say that, by a Warden. In 1836, the first reaction to the Israelite theory, which is that a man named Constantine Rafinesque in Kentucky, he's a professor in Kentucky, he's actually a crypto-Jew. He's from Europe, of Jewish origin, reacts against the Book of Mormon as a Jew would react to a virulently anti-Semitic text, and publishes his own Walam Olam, which is in part a parody of the Book of Mormon, often misinterpreted, saying the mounds were built by Cherokees, which is intended to refute the Israelite theory. In 1848, a version of the Roberdeau map is published as part of Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley by Squire and Davis, making the work known to a white public. That's this book right here. This is a reprint, obviously. And after it becomes widely known, copies of ancient monuments are distributed to every member of Congress, okay? So this becomes extremely important. And now this will test you, history buffs. Who was a member of Congress in 1848? What is the most prominent name who was in the, Abraham Lincoln was a congressman in 1848. So Abraham Lincoln gets a copy of Ancient Monuments, and he's about to retire from politics, or so he thinks. And so he's looking for a new profession, and he considers that he will become a natural historian. And so getting this book motivates Lincoln to make a trip to Ohio to check out these earthworks because he's thinking of becoming a natural historian. We might all be thankful that he didn't make that career choice. Next. So the big question now is, who is Isaac Roberdeau? And this is the question that he would do this, that he would alter the image, which had such profound consequences. Namely, it kind of started the Mormon religion by instigating Joseph Smith into writing a fictional book about Native Americans starting as Israelites, right? All of this is a repercussion of the Roberdeau drawing. So who is this guy, right? Well, so I naturally turned to, there is an official genealogy of the Roberdeau family to figure out who this guy really was. Now, I had my suspicions. You may be able to tell that I'm Jewish. And I know members of the clan. And I had my own great-grandfather was named Isaac. And many, many Isaacs in my family tree. So I had a suspicion. Could Isaac Roberdeau possibly be Jewish? And the name Roberdeau is extremely suspicious, shall we say, because it is an extraordinarily rare name. In fact, there's only one Roberdeau family in the United States, and that's this family. There are no other Roberdeaus. And I've done a search on the name. Elsewhere, it only exists in France. But it appears to exist only among descendants of the Huguenots and Jews of France, crypto-Jews, that is to say, not among the French Catholics. It's not a name of ancient French, lineage. And so it's the kind of name that crypto-Jews would have adopted because it can't really be, no one can tell from the name alone where it comes from or what it is. And the fact that it has this French suffix, right, that doesn't really mean anything in the name. There's no meaning of this name that makes sense. What it looks like is someone attached a French suffix to the name Robert, which was a popular name in France, to make it look French, to try to be French, right, or try to pass, as they say. And it's very similar to the name Rafinesque, who was another crypto-Jew, who also has an invented name with a French suffix that was tacked on to, right, Rafinesque, doesn't mean anything except that it looks French. So very similar. And so I thought, well, the genealogy is going to explain this. Well, but what it says is, and I know you probably can't read this from where you're sitting, this is all it says about the name. This is supposed to be a genealogy of the entire family, of the pedigree of Isaac Roberdeau in France. And this is the grandfather of the Isaac Roberdeau we've been talking about. So his grandfather was also named Isaac Roberdeau and left France. Of his pedigree, the writer has attempted but little search owing to distance and the difficulties in procuring information. And it goes on, and it basically tells you we don't know anything about this family, or where it comes from, or what its lineage is, right? It seems to kind of pop out of nowhere with the elder Isaac Roberdeau. And then it gives an extended, lengthy genealogy of the elder Isaac Roberdeau's wife, as if that's going to substitute for the name Roberdeau. So it really doesn't tell us much. Now, it does say that he was supposedly a native of Rochelle, La Rochelle, in France, who with many others left his native country upon the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Now that's really important because the Edict of Nantes, I see some people know about it, the Edict of Nantes was basically a treaty signed at the end of what were called the Wars of Religion in France. These were wars between the Catholics and the Protestant Huguenots, who in the 16th century really vehemently attacked each other over and over again, causing mass atrocity after mass atrocity. Those wars were ended by a treaty called the Edict of Nantes, which allowed the Huguenots and Jews, by the way, who were lesser in number, but very important in this time period, to have their own refuges, to live in their own cities and not be harassed by the Catholics. So the Catholics would essentially leave these few places alone. And La Rochelle was the principal one. So the fact that that Isaac Roberdeau comes from La Rochelle is strongly indicative that he's either a Huguenot or a Jew. Especially since he leaves France after those edicts are revoked. Next. So the genealogy, by the way, they call him a Huguenot. And the biographies that have been written about him do say he's a Huguenot. But that was because to have called him a Jew would have been considered a derogatory at the time. So calling him a Huguenot was more out of politeness in that day and age than it was anything else. Now, these two maps show you just a little bit about the history. Now, you may know that in 1492, Jews were expelled from Spain. And following that, in 1497, they were expelled from Portugal. This were massive numbers of Jews. These Jews from both Spain and Portugal largely emigrated and went to southern France. This is a map of where Jews settled in France, where Sephardic Jews settled in France. The blue symbols, which are all in the south, are cities of that were majorly settled by Sephardic Jews who had been previously in Iberia, and many of whom became crypto-Jews, meaning they tried to blend in with French society, and so that they would no longer be harassed and have prejudice against them. This is a map of the Huguenot territories in France, and the triangle, the four triangles, are the four cities that were the refuges set aside for Huguenot settlement. And what you can see from these maps is that the Huguenot areas are largely corresponding to where the Jews also lived, and that's largely because Jews flocked to the Huguenot areas in order to have protection against the Catholic pogroms and other forms of discrimination. So this all leads us even more to conclude that Isaac Roberdeau the Elder was indeed a refugee Jew. Next. Isaac goes to the West Indies. He goes to St. Kitts, the island of St. Kitts, where his son is born. His son is named Daniel Roberdeau. Again, kind of, you don't want to draw conclusions from names alone, but Isaac and Daniel are certainly within the Judaic fold, let's say. And Daniel becomes extremely important in American history. He moves to Philadelphia from St. Kitts, becomes a very wealthy business owner and industrialist, invested in timber and in lead mining. He, in the 1770s, becomes pro-revolution, becomes a founder of the Masonic Lodge of Philadelphia. Again, many Jews became Masons in that time because it was a way of sort of being accepted by the general society. And the Masonic lodges did accept Jews and, in fact, had a high opinion of Jews during that time. So many prominent Freemasons were actually Jews or crypto-Jews. And Roberdeau was one of them in Philadelphia, becomes a close friend of Benjamin Franklin, of course. Franklin introduces him to the rest of the revolutionary crew. And Roberdeau becomes a politician, runs for Continental Congress, is at first defeated because of anti-Semitic propaganda spread by the Tories of Philadelphia, who spread propaganda. You might get some sense of this from what's going on now, today in America, saying, oh, you don't want to vote for Roberdeau, he's really a Jew, right? And making all these arguments about how his father, called himself a Huguenot, but he's not really a Huguenot. And there were comments made about their facial features, which I don't need to get into. But the second time, Roberdeau is elected to Continental Congress in 1777 to 1779. He serves in the Continental Congress, which is when the Articles of Confederation are signed, and that makes him the only Jewish signer of the Articles of Confederation. Next. So, and that was actually recognized in the congressional record, just so you know, I'm not making all this up, Bill Schuster, who represented Altoona, Pennsylvania in 2008, entered this into the congressional record. In 1778, General Daniel Roberdeau, a Jew from York, right, now it's openly being said, Pennsylvania, and a member of the Continental Congress, became aware of the presence of lead mines in central Pennsylvania. At his own expense, General Roberdeau traveled to our region and built a fort in what would one day become Altoona to begin mining and processing much-needed lead ammunition to General Washington's troops at Valley Forge. So you can see he's now become a general in Washington's army, very important guy. And now don't flip it yet, but get ready to. All right. So there's further a very unimpeachable source who says that the Roberdeaus were actually a Jewish family. And when I say unimpeachable, I'm making a play on words because this is another president of the United States. Guess which one? Well, that's an unfair question. I haven't given you enough clues. It is John Adams, the second president, who gets to know the Roberdeaus very well because when the Continental Congress meets in both Philadelphia and York, Adams lodges in the homes that Roberdeau owns. So he becomes a lodger with the Roberdeaus. And what I consider my great discovery is discovering a letter that John Adams writes to Abigail Adams. And here's the letter. This is the actual letter. And the middle paragraph says, I am lodged in the house of General Roberdeau, an Israelite indeed, I believe, who, with his sisters and children and servants, do everything to make us happy. We are highly favored. Okay. So this is what I meant in the beginning, but I said this really is about the Israelites. Of those children who attended John Adams was none other than Isaac Roberdeau, who grows up to make the alterations on the Clermont County map, okay, suggesting that the earthwork was made by Israelites. He, because of his father's great influence, becomes the chief assistant to L'Enfant, who is the, you know who L'Enfant is? No. Who is the prominent Freemason charged with building the city of Washington, D.C., directly by Washington, put in charge of it because Washington was a prominent Freemason and wanted the city of Washington to reflect Masonic symbolism and, so there are all these books, many of them that you can buy that they're written in conspiratorial framework, but there's really no conspiracy. It was an open secret that Washington wanted the city of Washington, the city named after him, made into a kind of shrine to the symbolisms of Freemasonry. And so, next. Oh, I just wanted to give you just so you can keep it in mind the basic central Roberdeau lineage from Isaac the Elder to Daniel to Isaac Roberdeau the Younger. They've whoever put that image there, that wasn't me, got that mixed up. That was Daniel Roberdeau, is that picture, and we don't have any good likenesses of either of the Isaacs. Next. So in Washington, D.C., as a result of L'Enfant and his assistant, Roberdeau, there is a pentagram encoded into the street network, and there is a Masonic square and compass in the street layout. And you can go on and on. You can buy these books and you can read on and on. So Isaac Roberdeau was essentially schooled in putting secret symbols into modern works and ancient works. That was his business. So we have no doubt about, whether he manipulated the picture of the earthwork here in Clermont County. Next. Now, something that few people know, unless you're a Mason yourself, is that Masons have a cult around a certain number. George Washington, this is in part because of George Washington, who revered and thought there was all this mystical significance of a certain number. What is that number?
33.
No. It's 39. And why is it 39? Very strange number. Okay. Well, probably originally, this goes back to Europe, so it wasn't an American invention. It's probably because the 39th parallel goes through certain islands in the Aegean, which were considered the cultic origins of Freemasonry, right? The temples of Athena and temples of other Greek gods that the Masons worshipped all lay on the 39th parallel, okay? And Washington imbued this symbolism because his home, Mount Vernon, is close to the 39th parallel. And so when Washington surveyed Ohio, Washington followed the 39th parallel through Ohio. And I have a home in Pike County, and we actually have boundary markers in Pike County along the 39th parallel that were left by Washington, right? He wanted to mark the parallel, okay? That was incorporated into the compass and square symbol of Freemasonry because the compass is set at 39 degrees, right? You can get some Freemason to verify that. But it went beyond that. Next. Because the District of Columbia as a whole was designed with Washington's inspiration to be a perfect square with the northern point resting where? On the 39th parallel, okay? All by George Washington's design. Now, this was all done in the 18th century. So long before the earthwork in Clermont County is known. But what I meant before by the fact that the earthwork is on the 39th parallel, that had to be taken as extraordinarily significant to the Masonic fraternity in D.C., who were all aware of this this arrangement. And so now you had this ancient earthwork, possibly built by quote unquote Israelites, that happens to be sitting right on the mystical parallel. And this had to be behind much of this thinking. Next. And this is all just to show that this is a set of Masonic symbols, including the menorah. So the Masons used many Judaic symbols, including both the oil lamp and the menorah, converted them into Masonic symbols. Next. And I think I just wanted to reinforce that idea. Next. And that's basically it. Now there are certain actions that you may consider. I hope you all join the Adina Core group on Facebook. My email address is given there. But as a historical society, I would suggest humbly that you be the ones to propose that the name of the earthwork be changed. It should not be called Hanukkiah Mound anymore. The people who call it Hanukkiah Mound are an assortment of literal neo-Nazis and others who want to, and Mormons, I should say, have adopted that name, who want to, create false ideas about appropriating the Native American heritage and kind of using this fake sense of Judaism to do that. And people in Clermont County should not be a party to that. So the earthwork needs a new name. Some have called it the East Fork Works, but that's not an adequate name because there were many different earthworks along the East Fork. This is clearly a special one. And so you might consider making a proposal that, and I think it would be covered in the media, I think it's a great story. So that's just an idea. Any questions?
Yeah, where is that?